Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Nick Jonah. I work at Counterpoint Arts. I'm the creative producer, or one of the creative producers for the Pop Change program. So a little bit about Counterpoint Arts, for those of you that don't know us. We're a national organisation in the fields of arts, migration and cultural change. Our mission is to support and produce the arts by and about migrants and refugees, seeking to ensure that their contributions are recognised and welcomed within British arts, history and culture. And central to our mission is our belief that arts can inspire social change and enhance inclusion and cultural integration of migrants and refugees. The Pop Change programme is coming up to it's about 3 years now, and really it was set up to develop the public understanding and appreciation of migrants and refugees in the UK using the power of pop culture and social change. And our activities have spanned from project commissions. We've done a lot around comedy. We did, as you saw in my notes to you all, a football song with Lady Lisha and football fans. And then we've done a number of things in gaming and media, and we've had a series of retreats. This salon series, which is the first one, is it's just an opportunity for you to mix, mingle, network with a number of people. We're going to have about 4 more over the course of the next 6 months. And some of them will be online and some of them will be live, but we'll be able to share more about that as we develop the programs further. I want to take this moment to thank our funders, Open Society Foundation and Unbound Philanthropy, for all your continued support. And before we get started with the panel, I just want to go over a couple of house rules. There's lots of people here today. I've kind of been checking out the guest list, and we've got people from Morocco, from the Netherlands, from the US, from Belgium, and of course from across the UK. And of course, everybody's coming in from different backgrounds, different starting points, different experiences. So can we just ask for a little bit of generosity as these conversations progress? If you get a little bit nervous or uncomfortable with something, you can always reach out in the chat and you'll see that at the bottom left-hand side, to anybody who's got Counterpoint Arts in their title. So it's Diana Rakovic, Tom Green, Annie Hall, Marcia Chandra, also myself, Almir Kolzitz, and Anya O'Brien. We're all here to support and help. If anyone gets triggered or is feeling a bit uncomfortable and they need to have a chat, just reach out to us. And before I hand over, I'm just going to explain a little bit about AirMeet. At the bottom, where you see the smiley face, this is where you can show your appreciation. I see some people have already found the button, because I see all the smiley faces and claps and things like that. Oh, lots of love hearts coming up. That's nice. If you want to ask the question in the Q&A section, all I would ask that you do is either put it in the chat. If you want to put your hand up, I'm asking for people to be concise. If you're kind of still thinking about your point and you need to land your point, you'll have time to do that in the lounge section or even in the speed networking section. So I hope that's works for you guys. I'm going to now hand over to Biz. Biz, also known as K Bizwas, he's an editor, broadcast, and a critic. He's done a number of events with us already. I think he's freaking amazing. He's written for the Nation, the Times Literary Supplement, New Statesman. I think you said that you had something coming out with a New Statesman around this football stuff. He's also the editor for Representology, and if you haven't checked it out, we will put it in the chat. It's a wicked editorial that really has some great articles about diversification in the media. And he also, and I don't know where he has all the time to do all of this, he's also the director at Resonance FM. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Biz and I'll see you guys a bit later. Bye.
Thank you so much, Nike. As Nike says, I'm Biz. I am delighted to introduce 2 magnificent panelists. I have Leah Cowan, who's the former politics editor at Galdem and the author of Border Nation, which is out now on Pluto Press. And the writer and researcher Selina Nwulu, whose creative work has been featured everywhere from The Guardian to Vogue and ID magazine. The 3 of us are going to aim to discuss popular culture in Britain and its potential in accelerating social change and addressing structural inequalities and promoting racial justice. Communities of colour often feel locked out of elite political and social circles and see culture as a site of expression. A new wave of radical pop cultural expression, which has been dormant for much of the 21st century, may be emerging in film and television, fashion and music. But what influence will this have in Britain for those interested in achieving racial justice? As Nike mentioned, if you have questions for the panelists, please leave them in the chat box. So I thought we'd start with a question around the current moment, which is popular culture seems to often open the door to those public conversations in Britain about race and racism. We've seen recently the England footballers taking the knee at the European Championships. As a recent example, we also have at the start of the year Meghan Markle appearing on Oprah. Are these public conversations around race and racism able to be nuanced, or will those fighting for racial justice always be on the back foot? I'd like to ask the panelists that.
Leah, I don't know if you want to go first. Okay, thank you. Hi. Yeah, I mean, I think that the conversation certainly has moved. I was thinking about, just how we're framing conversations now. And even 10 years ago, we couldn't say things like whiteness or white privilege or white supremacy. And so I do think that it's important to acknowledge the distance that we've kind of traveled. But I do think that it is missing nuance. And I do think that we're only just starting to even talk about this idea of action and reparation as opposed to, the kind of piecemeal diversity and inclusivity schemes, which, all have a place, but don't necessarily speak on a kind of systemic level. And, thinking about things around the football and all the rest of it, I think that racism within football is not a new thing. I would personally still feel very uncomfortable going to a football match. But I do think that the attention that it's been given is perhaps a little new, but I still don't think the conversation is including the wider context, which enables people to feel they're able to disregard what taking a knee means, is that where people are able to boo at football players, and obviously when missed a penalty, the racist backlash. I think that what has been discussed is the kind of the surface level of it, that the name calling is wrong, as opposed to the bigger systemic context where these things can happen, these words are available, these actions are available with impunity.
Yeah, kind of completely echo what Selina said. I think it's very evident from the kind of policy level response. I think there was something I saw in the news about Boris Johnson saying that, racists are going to be banned from football matches or whatever, or people who are tweeting racist things. And I was kind of speaking to some friends about this in a very tongue-in-cheek way, to be clear, kind of saying, well, no, I'd rather they stayed at the football matches because then we know where they are and I can just stay away. Obviously, that's not how it works. But it really shows us that there's no real impulse to address the kind of structural issues and inequalities that underpin a scenario where we get, this vast swathe of racism being directed at these three athletes who were performing. And instead, these really piecemeal, very performative gestures of like, yeah, we'll ban you from attending a football match, as if that's going to actually address the issue in front of us in any kind of meaningful way. But more kind of broadly, I think that pop culture is actually very well placed to hold a mirror up to the inequality in society, as well as to imagine and reimagine different realities. And I just wanted to kind of name check a few examples. I think in the past 5 years, we've seen things like, Small Acts, Steve McQueen's 5-part TV series, which explores the lives of West Indian communities in London, and Michaela Cole's I May Destroy You, which is this very painful but vital representation of sexual violence as experienced by a survivor. We've seen films like Parasite and Get Out, which pose these really unflinching critiques of inequality along lines of class and race. Of course, you know, we couldn't forget Black Panther, the first kind of big budget superhero movie with a Black hero and director and majority Black cast. And then, you know, in films like music, we've seen releases like WAP by Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, which provides this kind of really joyful, unapologetic, sex positive celebration of freedom and enjoyment and self-determination. All of these different pieces of work really did spark discussions about race and racism and how it intersects with gender and class and different sites of oppression in different ways. And I think these different formats and approaches, including things like football, including things like, you know, interest around celebrity royals, if that's your bag, allows for these different entry points into the discussion, which is really important. I think that's a positive thing. For me, though, this is part of a larger struggle. It's not the most kind of radical or change-making aspect of that struggle, but it is part of it. And I don't think we can be kind of puritanical about what change is. It does mean something to have the type of artistic expression being celebrated in the mainstream that I've just mentioned, and to have athletes like Marcus Rashford being celebrated in the mainstream for a temporary period of time, right, in a very conditional way. The trick is to not kind of load it with meaning beyond the fact that these pieces of work and these, you know, athletes and creatives and individuals are brilliant, they exist and they're out there, but our work continues. Our work, our kind of social justice work to make change and build the world we want to see continues nonetheless.
Thanks both for perfectly setting the scene. Now, the three of us are speaking just over a year after the Black Lives Matter protests in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder in America and its translation over the Atlantic to Britain. How are we to understand the entertainment industry's support of Black Lives Matter in this modern setting? As I'm sure most of the audience know, Black Lives Matter as a movement predates the murder of George Floyd by several years. And as a number of us have argued in the past, it is a continuation of a long-standing civil rights struggle that's been going on for decades, some would argue centuries, in the United States. So why is it now that the entertainment industry sees itself able to support BLM? And can we be heartened by these cultural gestures, or is there a risk of commodification?
I'll jump in this time. I think, you know, of course, social movements are always co-opted, or there are always attempts to co-opt them, I think. And we only have to look at how something like, you know, feminist discourse broadly has been taken on by capitalism, you know, through these attempts to tell women to lean in the boardroom, to get ahead, the best revenge is your paper, all that kind of business. There's not really about meaningful social change. It's about adopting the language and the affect of social justice for the benefit of, in this example, business. And we could kind of make the same comparisons around things like BLM and things like Pride. You know, we see companies like the Home Office with their rainbow profile pictures on Twitter while they're continuing to deport people who are fleeing persecution because of their sexuality or their gender identity, and persecution based on laws that Britain put in place during colonialism, by the way. So we have to be very kind of skeptical, I think, of these shows of support, whatever industry or kind of sector they're coming from, and actually interrogate, are they actually underpinned by anything real?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think too also just link that. Yes, we can talk about the entertainment industry, but it is sector wide, and this idea of, you know, this commodification is definitely there, and you see it. I mean, you saw it, you know, in the direct aftermath of the George Floyd murder, and the hashtags and the black squares that have never been followed up, as far as I can see, by any kind of tangible action. And I think this is the nature of the mainstream. We can also say the nature of whiteness, that it kind of consumes trends, and it consumes, you know, cultures into kind of meaning, into something meaningless. So even the word woke RIP, doesn't mean anything now because it has been co-opted. And so I think generally this kind of like BLM solidarity, I think while there are, some shifts have been made, we also have to be wary of how it is being diluted. And you think, in particular to the entertainment sector, it does have this kind of history of minstrelsy, right? So, Black and brown people can be visible at the front of the stage as long as you entertain us, as long as you are palatable. And so, again, when we're seeing these shifts, is it meaningful change? Is it a specific kind of Blackness that is becoming acceptable? It comes back to this idea of systemic change, of deep-rooted change. And is it the kind of tokenistic view of BLM versus actually what people are actually calling for?
I've always felt that politicians are decades behind sort of cultural shifts that take place. When I was born in 1984, we had a radical understanding of Black cultural expression that got to the top of the charts, that produced these wonderful, like, standout figures on television and in the music industry. And yet we had no one in Parliament who was a person of colour. And then 4 came in 1987. So I kind of understand about the Black experience being reflected in popular culture when those economic and political spaces are shut. But is it possible to harness the cultural success of Black artists for political and social change? And are we seeing the kind of early stages of that in Britain, would you say?
I think my question would be, who is doing the harnessing? Do you kind of mean in sense of kind of artists using their art as a kind of vehicle for social change, or kind of other groups?
I suppose I'm asking whether movements can be heartened by Black artists in a pop cultural space reflecting the idea that Britain is suffering structural racism, and can they use that, I suppose, wide-scale imagery and artistry to build social and political movements on the ground? Because I'd argue, let's say something like Stormzy's presence at the Brit Awards, having a go at the government, wasn't an act in and of itself. It was something that the movement, this activist movement, took to heart. It was something that gave them, I think, more confidence to continue. And we see that in relation to let's say the Grenfell activism, when those political avenues were shut down just over a year after the Grenfell fire, we still had Stormzy keeping it alive, and the movement itself is still alive and will continue to seek justice for those who are killed there.
Yeah, just to say briefly, because I think I'd have to have a bit more of a think about this, but I do think that it everything is like feeding into everything. So I don't know if, I feel like there's always like a tipping point, or like a moment that you harness and then other things can follow. So when I think about like even stuff around Stephen Lawrence and around Windrush, there was a critical point, and then the people that have already been talking, making work around that issue can kind of move forward and maybe be seen in a more visible way than they had been previously. But I think we could argue that there's lots of people who've been talking about Grenfell, talking about systemic racism, artists who aren't necessarily listened to, and so I think it's kind of strategic moments, which is part policy, part pop culture, part activism, grassroots, on a grassroots level, that all kind of which forms part of this movement that that I think adds to it. But I think the power is that the storytellers, the artists, can give words and emotions to it in a way that maybe others can't, and so that's what maybe is the most visible. That's what takes hold. I guess I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Selena. I think it's all absolutely kind of interconnected and fluid and really hard to pin down the causality of like. It's interesting when you were saying there's the idea that the activist movement took heart from Stormzy. My experience was like the reverse, in that like, you know, the activism had been bubbling away for a long time, and by the time I got to Glastonbury and saw Stormzy on the stage saying that thing, I was almost a bit like, well, we're kind of past that point. I don't know if that's sacrilegious to say at this point, but I don't know. It was exciting, but the causality for me was kind of flipped, I think, which is interesting. I've got kind of two slightly probably incoherent thoughts about this. One is that like I don't see the locus of change being parliament necessarily, or kind of parliamentary politics. So when you have something like, for example, the Kill the Bill protests, which were protests against the police, courts, crime and sentencing, I can never get them in the right order, that bill that we all know is terrible, that wasn't necessarily around, you know, our one sole focus here is to get Parliament to listen to us and to not make this bill happen, even though it sounds like that absolutely is what the protests are about. When the bill did pass through Parliament, that wasn't the kind of end of the road of that movement and that struggle and that piece of resistance. It was a kind of a part of it, which perhaps links tenuously to a point that Selina made around kind of Windrush as a really good example of something where, yeah, absolutely, there were people who'd been working on the issue for a long time, and maybe it was an opportunity where they kind of came to the fore and had their work recognised. And there were also people who hadn't been working on it for a long time, actually didn't have politics that aligned with the issues that were rising. Certain Guardian journalists, who I won't name, who actually profited quite a lot, you know, really expanded their journalistic portfolios off the back of the Windrush campaign, but then were very happy to go and like go on a police ride along to a nail bar and do a raid themselves, like, you know, a couple of months later. So clearly not having the political underpinnings to match up with the issues that were like really affecting people in the here and now. So there's something interesting there, I think, for me, and around who kind of benefits from the pop culture trends, if you will, that spark up around different social movements. And yeah, absolutely linked to what Selina was saying about the nature of whiteness kind of being something that consumes trends into something meaningless, or at least something meaningless to us, right? Something that doesn't advance our struggles.
Yeah,
Yes.
if I could I just respond to that? Because I think that's such an important point, and I think that's something I've definitely, you know, seen, I felt affected by, as somebody who, you know, creates art and writes on social justice, climate justice, and, you know, you want as many people to be writing about it as possible. But I do think it's very interesting that people who already have that platform, so that whatever they say whenever they decide to say it is taken up, and they are then the first to be writing about it, when actually those that don't have that social cultural capital, who have been just like, you know, slogging away in the back, are not necessarily seen. And actually those of us who have been slogging away at the back have been developing the nuance and trying to also reflect respectfully, if there are experiences that aren't ours, you know, this message, which is then steamrolled over somebody who then thinks it's an interesting thing to take up for while it's popular and then leaves it. And how does that take away from the larger message, from the larger work that we're trying to do? It can be actually.
There's so many brilliant points that the panelists are coming out with. If you're watching this and you would like to leave questions in the chat box for them, we'll come to them later in our conversation. I do want to pick up on something that Selina has said. So at the start of this year, Selina did a lot of research on work within the cultural and creative industries, and that collaboration between the racial justice and the arts sector. And what you uncovered were issues around underfunding of Black cultural expression, gatekeeping, knowledge extraction. I was wondering if you could just tell the audience a bit about what you found as the barriers between the arts sector working with the racial justice.
Sure, and I think what was the most kind of interesting or new thing about this piece of work was the context, because actually the people that I spoke to and the things that they said about their experiences with working with cultural and predominantly white institutions was very much stuff that they could have been saying 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So, you know, this stuff around lack of acknowledgement of historical and institutional power, and that being very damaging, again, is something that we've experienced long before now. But I think what was the kind of the turning point, or the interesting thing that people were reflecting back to me, was this sense of, but now, you know, in this kind of like BLM moment, being heightened anyway, there is an opportunity for us to name it in a way that we haven't previously. And so there was hope in that this could maybe be pushed forward, because, you know, yeah, like the kind of barriers were long established, the gatekeeping, the knowledge extraction, the, you know, the power dynamics between, you know, a smaller grassroots organization and an established cultural organization, and actually being taken up again for being popular and then discarded with no provision of care. And so it's been quite superficial. And then when people just start to speak back or say something isn't right, there being a punitive culture where they are kind of not, where there may be, they don't get the opportunity to finish the work, do the work again, or are, you know, walk away with a reputation of being difficult. So I think they were kind of the very, you know, they were the barriers. But I think the hope was that, you know, now people are starting to reckon with that. How can that now change these relationships? How can we name the fact that, you know, where have these white institutions, cultural institutions, got this power to begin with? Why are they calling all the shots in the first place? Cultural, but also financial power really is, you know, runs through all these collaborations. And so again, if we're talking on a systemic level, then we have to have that conversation about where you've got this resource in the first place, to even be talking about issues that then, you know, a Black or Brown organization is trotted out for and then hidden away from. Why aren't those organizations making those strategic decisions? So
it's a brilliant piece of research, and it's been dropped into the chat box, a link to that full report. There was another report out at the start of the year, which I was honoured to write the foreword for, which was called New Brave World. And Leah was one of the contributors who wrote a fantastic essay on Bridgerton and the idea of period dramas, the potential for it to be a place where the Black feminist imagination can find itself. And in the most recent issue of Representology, of which I'm the editor, we did an interview between Lenny Henry and Amma Asante, who I think is credited as the first person to introduce Black characters within that historically white period drama space. And she argues very simply that no longer can the BBC have commission a period drama without having Black characters in it. And I wanted Leah to possibly kind of explore the themes within her essay in New Brave World, which I'm sure someone will drop in the chat. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Classic pandemic rookie error. For a show like Bridgerton, I think we're being presented with kind of extreme wealth and decadence as our starting point. And in Bridgerton, as is very typical in a period drama universe, you know, women are bred and traded like cattle in order to consolidate or protect ostensibly men's access to land or property or capital. So I think when that's the kind of starting point of many of these period dramas, the extent to which Black women in particular can be shown as being kind of agents in their own and each other's lives is, as is perhaps kind of historically accurate, very questionable. But I think there were some really great instances in that show where I saw the potential, not as fleshed out as I would have enjoyed, but the potential for pop culture in this instance to be a site of expression and social struggle. And in Bridgerton specifically, there's the characters of Will the boxer and his wife Alice. And, you know, we really enjoy their decision to con their rich punters rather than kind of endlessly groveling to the aristocracy. And it's a kind of rare moment of, I can't think of any other instance of seeing a period drama where two Black working class characters, you know, name the inequality that they're subject to and work together to take action against it. And we're also kind of gifted with the characters of Lady Danbury and Queen Charlotte, who played by brilliant actors and weave very kind of compact, albeit but compelling kind of tapestries from their allotted bits of the narrative. But I think often these discussions lead to a broader question about kind of representation and is that enough? And I think we've kind of touched on that a little bit already. And I think representation in pop culture is certainly important as people of colour, as Black people specifically. We've experienced historical erasure in popular culture. You know, we've been left with the fallout of what happens when you don't see yourself represented, or you only see yourself represented in particular ways in the media around you. And that kind of works to maintain social inequality. But I think we always have to be quite careful that representation, as I'm sure I'll keep kind of banging on, is like part of this wider struggle. It's never going to be the end goal. It's part of these very different approaches and divergent tactics that we can take to kind of move towards a different world that we want to be in.
I'd like to ask both of you about something that's been on my mind for a while, which is the influence of America over Britain and Britain's reaction to, I suppose, what is perceived as global events through the prism of America. So it feels that there's a degree of US influence over the UK response to George Floyd's murder. And in my opinion, it seems to be a watering down from those calls in the US for structural upheaval in terms of racial justice. And over here, as Leia's pointed out before, almost that it seems to be more calls for representation. And certainly what I've seen is a lot of institutions have been scared by something that they don't understand, which is I suppose, a historic call for racial justice. And their response to it is saying, well, superficially, we want more Black and Asian people to be present. Is that a fair reading, or have I got this wrong?
What do you think, Selena?
Thanks. Sorry, can you say that last bit again?
So in the US, it seems that the arguments being made by the Black Lives Matter movement have been calls to achieve racial justice in historically racially unjust America. Whereas over here, the public response seems to be calls for better representation for people of colour rather than structural upheaval. And part of me wonders why that is. I mean, here's another example in terms of Me Too. It seems that when Me Too began in America, there was seemingly an understanding of women's structural, like historic disparity between men and women in the US. Whereas over here, it seemed to focus on individual acts that may or may not have been perpetrated on prominent individuals within prominent institutions like the BBC or Parliament. And I almost feel that through crossing the Atlantic, there's a bit of a watering down, to mix my metaphors. And I wonder why that may be the case, or is that a fair reading, or do you think that actually movements and activists on the ground are replicating the work of activist movements in the States?
Yeah, I mean, I think to go back to the kind of George Floyd murder and BLM, you know, the fact that it kind of, you know, then sent shockwaves to this country, but also globally, was kind of bittersweet, because obviously you want we want as much attention on these issues as possible. But it kind of eclipses everything that activists, have been saying for how many years here. And it's very easy to conflate the US experience with the UK and global Black experience. And actually, that's part of the kind of racist ideology, that we're kind of all the same and our experiences are all the same. And so for me, it was kind of like, why is it taking this? And I think that's a whole other conversation of why it took that moment to kind of like open the door to more of these conversations, because it, decades of resistance, decades of dissent in the UK, kind of ignored for this moment. And I think it's all too easy to look to the US, which is far more, explicit, not without problems, but about its racial history, and it's, living live now. And actually, it's part of a Britishness to be, very subtle and underhand about race and even name it. So it's easy to name and point to the loud thing than the insidious nature of what happens here. And so I think that, and it's also easy to absolve, from a UK context, to absolve yourself of the insidious nature of racism here, when there's something as loud and as horrifying as what happened to George Floyd and countless others. So I think that's part of it. It's an absolving of, well, it's not that bad here, and let's look to the US, and yes, we can talk, but in this watered down way. I also think that, it is about kind of token like gestures and things to change, because what structural racism and understanding it requires is to bring down the entire house. And nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to ask those questions. People don't realize that racial injustice is an emotional issue. And I think that's what's been interesting about more people kind of, getting interested in it, like it's some kind of, interesting talking point. And they're not ready for the fact that this is an emotional thing. It literally shapes how I live, how you live, how everybody lives. And so are you ready for that? And actually people aren't, which is why it's easier to talk about these little changes on the surface of things than to actually do the deep digging that this really.
Yeah, I completely agree. Just to kind of add on what you were saying about it almost being this kind of interesting talking point, I definitely agree. That's been my experience too, that there's been this, I haven't been in both the US and the UK to kind of compare and contrast, but in the UK it feels very much like there's this kind of atomization of the issue down to like individual instances or individual even kind of institutions or individual statues about, if we can tackle this one thing, then maybe that's the solution, or that's enough. And I was with some friends, the person who made the comment was an acquaintance, not a friend, but they kind of said they're trying to regale me with this story about a particular footballer, this was many months ago, who didn't want to take the knee, and they didn't want to wear the BLM shirt or something. And he was like, isn't that really interesting? Isn't it interesting that he doesn't want to do that? And I was like, well, not really. Like, he's an individual. Just because he's a Black football player, it doesn't mean he's going to, be on board with BLM or want to be kind of tokenized in that way. And the fact that the conversation was getting boiled down to this thing of like, oh, there's this one Black person and they don't want to do it, and therefore perhaps that unravels the whole thing. It just, I thought was quite kind of a good example of that atomizing, and the way that the kind of conversation boils down to, no real discussion of like meaningful structural change, and more these kind of little talking points of little instances without much really thought or action underpinning it.
I think a lot about those potential George Floyd moments that we've had, certainly in my lifetime in Britain, that were very successful at getting the deaths of people of colour into the public eye, but then being unable to sort of create a movement in the way that in the aftermath of Floyd's murder, a movement was created around it. And I'm thinking of, let's say, the death of Mark Duggan, the death of Sean Rigg, the death of Joy Gardner. There have been countless moments. But what I find really interesting now, because of, I think, the fear of a movement being created, it's crystallized in this counter reaction. And something that I've heard a lot about George Floyd is that the same things that were bandied around when Mark Duggan was killed, which was this person was not a good person. This is from a kind of white lash perspective. You know, they had morals that weren't considered, you know, worthy of support, worthy of a movement being created around them. And I wondered if we could talk a bit about this counter reaction that's clearly taking place. There's like, feelings of progressive Black empowerment by the white majority hides the great unsaid, which is there's been a nativist backlash over the last 20 years in every Western country, whereby there's a blurring of the lines between the historic conservative right and the far right. And, you know, things that were considered post-war social or Christian democracy in America and in Western Europe have now become almost a fight between establishment parties and the perception of like far right parties on the outside. In many cases, Holland, Denmark, Norway, Switzerland, there's been a complete, fusing together between conservatism and far right nativism. And I was just going to ask you, what are we to make of these recent attacks on wokeness and the bemoaning of identity politics with the backdrop of this growth in nativism?
Thanks, Selena. I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of discussion about this idea of a culture war and kind of things like debates about statues and people being deplatformed and concerns about free speech and old tweets being dragged up that are problematic and people being penalized for them, rightfully or wrongfully so. And I kind of wonder if sometimes that kind of culture war idea is something that's quite kind of, if not manufactured, then kind of amped up or exaggerated by media, by people like me, so that they can, report on it as a concrete thing. I think we can kind of consider how wide-ranging the kind of supposed culture war actually is. Is it a debate between two kind of opposing but relatively small segments of society, and then actually the majority of people that might not be the people in power or the people in parliament, but the majority of people are kind of in between those points, but maybe have a range of views on different issues which are quite changeable and not kind of locked in this battle. I think these discussions seem to include a lot of focus on symbols and kind of, as I was just saying before, kind of penalizing individuals rather than criticizing structures and trying to rectify their impacts. And I think symbols are, of course, important. And, I don't think it's where the site of the battle actually is. What underpins someone's commitment to, for example, keeping a statue of Churchill standing is a wish to kind of not disrupt the status quo, a refusal to recognize the history of colonialism linked to this country. And I think that's a big part of the difference between the way discussions pan out in the US and here. There's this kind of ongoing denial of the fact that Britain has invaded, 90% of the world, even if we kind of apparently don't, see racism in our face in this stark manner. And a kind of lack of will to do anything to address the legacy of that, which continues into the present day. Removing the statue doesn't address this necessarily. It might provide some respite to us as people of colour and people from formerly colonised countries, and that is valid. But I think, as I've been saying, I'm more kind of interested in structural change. Are we developing justice and, recovery approaches in our communities, which means that we don't need to call the police when we see or experience harm? So, I think sometimes I'm a bit cautious around this idea of a culture war in itself. And I kind of want to, invite us to bring a bit more nuance into that and think about who are these groups that are having these discussions. I hear a lot about it because I'm on Twitter, but is that, a bit of a bubble, and what are the kind of broader discussions and debates and positions that are being held?
Yeah, for sure. And I also just think you know, for me, when you say that, I think about this kind of attack on wokeness. What does that even mean? Again, this idea that this is being made meaningless. And, you know, what I can understand of it is, you know, the backlash that has come when people have been given more of a platform to speak about race, and the backlash of being called a snowflake, or that that's not true, and all the rest of it. And I think, you know, we have to understand and remember that this is also part of the racist ideology, right? That we are not to be believed. So, you know, like, to understand and listen to that without demeaning it and calling it, you know, woke or being a snowflake or being paranoid, to actually believe it is to trust me, is to trust Black and brown people. And inherently within racism, that doesn't happen. So even with the backlash, that in itself is just racism continuing and maintaining its status quo. Why would you trust me? Why would you say that I am a source of authority? Well, that flies in the face of what you believe, of what culturally is believed. So, you know, for me, it doesn't make it any easier, but for me, it does reflect the bigger issue, and the fact that part of this kind of backlash, this resistance, these culture wars, is the attempt to maintain the status quo, which is kind of based on this.
I think I also wanted to pick up on one of the points that you made, Biz, around this kind of fear of a movement. I think it's quite important to be clear that there is a movement. It's not something that's a threat or something that might happen and there needs to be a backlash to kind of stop it from happening. It's already here, and I think it's really important to really kind of conceptualize the fact that there are people, grassroots groups, individuals, kind of chipping away at the hostile environment, for example, from every angle. People that are fighting back against things like right to rent, people that are fighting back against things like raids, people that are working around police monitoring and brutality. Even if the way that a kind of movement is maybe conceptualized in media or film is, you know, a load of people on the street with placards, yeah, that's an important part of movements and struggles, but actually there is a massive anti-racist resistance movement in this country, and a long history of it, of course, and that is already happening. That's not something that's a threat that, you know, the backlash can keep down. It's here to stay, and it's going to continue.
I think that's a really good point. I suppose what I would say is kind of, unlike the US, those movements are yet to be part of a national story in the way that, say, something like MLK Day, Black History Month, even some of the pop cultural expressions through film and music have been center stage in associating, I suppose, Blackness with America. I feel that whilst those movements have been going on since, you know, the post-war waves of migration, it's only now that we can have a national conversation about Britain that includes, even though it might be individual, people of colour. And I feel that our movements need to spend time in finding ways of recreating that history of our presence here that can form a coherent narrative to include us in the British national story. And I think that lots of people are fighting for that, but I do still feel that we're in the early stages. But I was hoping we could go to some questions from the audience. Let me read a few out for the last 15 minutes. Here's a question. A friend recently said that his wish that England should not win the Euros because of the way that win would have been used by the government to gaslight on racism in this country and gloss over its corruption and incompetence. I mean, it's a statement, but we can turn it into a question, which is, I suppose, the response that we've seen from the England football team has been more positive from I suppose, a multicultural perspective than we would have hoped for in previous years, in part pushing back against that government narrative that, like, I don't really know what I'm trying to say here. What I'm trying to say is we were quite heartened by the reactions from the murals in Manchester, the I suppose solidarity between a multiracial England team, and it almost goes against this government's like denial of structural racism, as we've seen in, say, the Sewell report, which came out at the start of the year, that basically says racism doesn't exist. Do we have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my understanding of the question is like, in an alternate universe where England had won and we hadn't seen, as you say, the kind of mural of Marcus Rashford being defaced, like what would that have meant and how would that have felt, and how would the Conservative government have co-opted that? Like, absolutely, of course they would. They would take any opportunity to try and say, look at this good thing that's kind of nothing to do with us but something to do with England, and ignore the fact that we've been killing loads of people throughout the pandemic. But yeah, I suppose beyond that, I'm not really sure that I have many more kind of feelings about it, really. I think it seems quite obvious that would have been, I mean, you can just see from Priti Patel's kind of mealy-mouthed tweets saying that the racism that Marcus Rashford has received is terrible or whatever. Like, it's clear that they just kind of bend whichever way they think is necessary in order to kind of say and do the right thing, which I think is maybe the bigger theme of definitely kind of state government level responses to the kind of anti-racist protests over the past year or so, is they've waited till the last kind of possible moment to say or do anything gesturally or performatively in solidarity with these movements, and only because it would have been bad if they had not. It's not kind of, particularly rooted in any.
Yeah, I don't have much more to kind of add to that. I find it all really complicated, and like football in itself is like just so much part of this kind of nationalist, patriotic, project that the game in itself is something that I don't feel I can enjoy because it bleeds into it. I also think that it's just important. I think many people are more heightened to race now, but these things have always happened. And so, it is about a response, like they were saying, because now more people are watching and they're expecting it. Where were these, very flimsy statements of, concern or, criticism or whatever against the racists in the 80s? I mean, that's what I would have liked to have seen in a kind of meaningful way. So, I think it is just about the kind of where we are in this moment and what, slightly more that is being called of politicians to have a stance, some kind of stance on race. What it actually means, well, we can see what it means within their policies, and it means nothing.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, I similarly don't kind of engage in football for similar reasons, but I think it's interesting how short people's memories can be. You only have to look back to something like the Hillsborough disaster. The government doesn't really care about football fans broadly, particularly if you're kind of working class, whatever your kind of ethnicity or racial background is. So, it's kind of bizarre to me that people's memories can.
We have a question from Deepesh, who says, what do the panel think about popular cultures that are allowed the space to grow and spread while simultaneously putting up barriers for certain groups and cultures of people, and those popular cultures which are denied spaces to grow? So this is a question around, I suppose, barriers to, I suppose, accessing, creating popular culture, I would say.
I suppose my kind of entry point into this question is I used to work in a big theatre in central London, and it was, kind of very notable the amount of Black directors and Black plays written by Black writers that you had put on, as opposed to the space given to like, to at least 2 Shakespeare, like by the same guy, like every year, So that disparity is very evident. I think in terms of, maybe I'd need a specific example actually to have more of a response to that. But I'm sure Selina will actually be able to input more about the way that funding is allocated. I'm sure it's very disproportionate along lines of whether it's like a Black-led organisation or a kind of longer established white.
Well, yeah, no, I think I might need a bit more context as well. Is the question asking, about, there's sometimes there are kind of Black only spaces or POC only spaces, and whether that's a good thing? Am I understanding that correctly, or is there something?
I suppose that,
but yeah,
if the question asker can contextualize, that would be fantastic. What I've seen in sort of my area of media, let's say, is I've seen the attempt at Black and Asian-led initiatives in a historically like white saturated space start over the last 5 years. Leah, you were obviously working at Galdem. There were, there are other organizations like Black Ballad and Skin Deep. I feel that there is an opportunity at this stage in, I suppose, communities of colours being in Britain that was kind of ruthlessly denied in the last decades of the 20th century. I think attempts at creating radical and popular Black-led and POC-led media, a lot of them suffered from, again, the things that Selina points out, which is like underfunding and gatekeeping from a lot of the people who would have given grants and things. And I feel that now there's at least a conversation is happening. I'm not going to put too much of a positive gloss on, but I do think that Black-led cultural spaces are now part of the cultural firmament in a way that they haven't been in the past. Maybe I'm being naive, but that gives me a lot of hope.
I think in terms of hope for me, and it kind of links to the point around representation, yes, it's brilliant that there are Black-led initiatives and publications that are being given funding or grabbing that funding themselves. I think there has to be a question around how are you setting up those spaces? Are you allowing your workers to unionize? How are you kind of running and managing those organizations? And also a question around, if a lot of money is being thrown at you, are you tearing up the rule book? Are you reshaping the industry? Or are you kind of creating a parallel structure that fits within the status quo, but enables, a bunch of donors or funders or trusts to say, like, yes, we're giving money to these Black people setting up this magazine, and that means that we're great. There's always that threat of being kind of co-opted and tokenized. And what kind of Biz was saying around those radical mouthpieces, having pieces of pop culture in this specific instance, journalism or publications that actually have that like firm political foundation that's underpinning the work that is done. I think there's still a big gaping hole for that to be filled.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think just to stress this idea of, Black-led or POC-led spaces, on the surface of things may look good and new, but if you are replicating the same structures, right, of, it's an ableist structure, it's the gender dynamics are off or problematic, all of these things. I think what happens is when we think about race and we're forced to think about race, we're missing nuance. So actually it's not enough just to be a POC or Black space. It's the building on Leah's point, it's the dismantling of these capitalist racist structures. So if it's exactly the same, but just with a POC face on it, then, how much progress is it? I also think that to go back to the funding structures and the power dynamics within it, where people are getting the funding from is really important, because it also then shapes what that POC space can do. And actually, if a funder is saying what we want is for you to do X, Y, Z, it may not actually fit with that Black or POC-led space agenda and the work that they actually want to do. And actually what happens is that then they end up pandering to a predominantly white funder. So it seems like it's this really radical progressive space. I have so many times done something which has been not fully what I wanted to do. I've tried to shoehorn what I wanted to do, but actually it was an agenda, it was a brief set by a funder who didn't actually have my experience. So I do think that, you know, it's really important to unpick, you know, beneath the kind of surface level to see what is happening behind the scenes and who is funding it and what's the criteria, what is the expectations from what is likely to be a white funder, and actually what is the culture within that space as well.
And also the idea that no matter how successful you are in these spaces, you can't run away from racism. I mean, what I found in putting together the first couple of issues of Representology is I'll speak to some of the most successful people. You've got actors like Adrian Lester and TV makers like David Olusoga and journalists like Gary Young. These are the people at the top of their game, and they have experienced racism throughout their career and are willing to talk about it. I'd extend that to, you know, someone as successful as Raheem Sterling in football, who's written very eloquently about the experience of racism that he's felt. To even Saida Varsi, the former chair of the Tory party, who experienced, she was at the top of the tree in the House of Lords as a Conservative and experienced racism. So it's this idea that you can't just be a successful person of color and then racism ends because of your success. No, it's ever present in the stories of the most prominent people of color in this country. And
can I just,
yeah, go
on. Because it's not about us and it's never been about us. It's about the lens through which we are seen. And that is inescapable. And I think for me, that's the thing of turning the issue on its head. We could be perfect, whatever perfect means. And it's not, it will never be enough, because if somebody is intent and understanding you in a certain way, because that's what we live in, that's what we've been told in every single possible direction within within pop culture, what we see, what we are, when we, what we see when we're not necessarily like conscious, just subconsciously what we're being told is that we are the problem. And so, so even if we are at the top of the tree, I mean, look at Meghan Markle. If we're talking about the epitome of power, she's basically the most perfect, in a very problematic way. She's the most perfect person who isn't white that could enter the royal family, and look at what has happened to her. So it's never been about us. It's how we are seen, and people who aren't willing to update, change, and actually look properly at the.
I've got one final quick question for both of you, which is, if you are a young person of colour in the creative industries or wishing to pursue work in culture in Britain, what one bit of advice would you give them? I'm happy to start.
I can jump in. I think it's kind of related to what we were just talking about in terms of, it's not enough to have black faces in high places. If you're wanting to work for an organization, or you are working with an organization and they're black led or they're POC led, or that the makeup of their staff is lots of POC, then also take the time to interrogate the kind of values and the politics and the structures of that organization. Don't just take it at face value, excuse the pun, that it's going to be, great just because that person, shares an identity with you or is living at a particular site of oppression. It's rare in arts organizations to actually have, that kind of radical structure and intent behind the work.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also just say from an artistic standpoint, it's like I'd also say that obviously people wanting to make a career out of it is one thing, but I think because again, it's so often not about us, and it's about, you know, just letting that one more palatable person, you know, have their moment a lot of the time, to move your center of approval, if that's the right way of saying it. Like, basically, don't wait for that to validate you as an artist or as a creative, because it's rarely about you. And obviously, still, you know, to want to make a living, sometimes we feel like we have to put ourselves in these spaces. But I do think being around people with your values, being part of a collective, creating art with people who actually, whose opinion you actually care about, whose opinion you actually rate, who actually are invested in you, and not for just some tokenistic, you know, project, I think is really important. I think that took me quite a while to understand.
I want to echo that advice and say, yes, you can find like-minded people who want to do the same thing as you. And the most important thing is to remove that financial barrier to access. Meet up with people who want to do the same thing as you. Meet up in places which you can meet for free. Don't create almost like membership networks where you have to give a stipend, you know, because what that will do is that will remove some of the, you know, if we're being honest, some of the most like raw talent within your industry. And that solidarity, certainly amongst people of color in Britain, is essential. And it's best to just remove that financial barrier. This has been a wonderful conversation for the last hour, and we've covered so much ground. I'd like to thank the two panelists, Selena Nwulu and Leah Cowan, and I'm going to hand back to Nike. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and I'm still kind of buzzing from this wonderful conversation. Thank you again, Biz, for beautifully moderating this discussion, and Selena and Leah, just absolutely brilliant, and particularly more interesting to have two women of colour sort of like putting viewpoints across that we don't always hear. Just kind of picking up on what you just said about actually what advice would you give to young people. You talked about networking and operating in spaces that are free. Well, of course, you all entered today. It was free. We've got a networking moment for about half an hour in what we call the lounge. So what you'll do is you'll come out of this space shortly. And if you go into the lounge and press speed networking, you'll get an opportunity to meet Biz, Selena, Leah, even me, and some other people who are at the discussion today. And I'm a real big believer that networking is a big key to kind of like moving beyond the limited space that you might sit within. I move across sector, internationally. I'm kind of known for networking, and I think these moments where you get to kind of bump into people are really useful. Now, some of you may be a little uncomfortable to do the speed networking. It's about 3 rounds of 3 minutes, just saying hello to people that you're randomly matched to. You can just go to any table between table 2 and 6 and just network and chat to whoever's there. But those of you who kind of want to be a little bit brave, if you get stuck, I guess a couple of questions you might ask, and these are always the questions I think about, is like, what have you learned? What's your learning been in the last year? What's been a big lesson to you in the last year? And what kind of advice would you give to people? So if you get a bit stuck and you don't know what to say to people, then you can just throw that out to the person that you get matched to. So you've got, well, I said, well, 6:45, it's 6:45 now. So maybe take a few minutes break and then come back at maybe 6:50. And then when you go, you can go into the lounge now and press speed networking. But when you go into the lounge, you can press it at 6:50 if you want a bit of a break right now. Okay, then we're going to end there. So you'll speed network. After the speed network's done, you can go to the table, discuss what you just heard with the people at the tables, swap, network, share ideas, all the things that help grow people's ideas and confidence in spaces like this. We will be in touch shortly. We'll be able to tell you what the next Pop Change Salon series is. It's likely to be in in September, and it will be comedy, but we'll be in touch through email and through our newsletter. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll see you in the lounge. Take care. Bye-bye.